In the shadowy corridors of the Cold War, where paranoia ruled and the balance of power was measured in megatons, the United States once drafted plans so devastating that even today, they read more like apocalyptic science fiction than military strategy. These were not just defensive blueprints, they were detailed instructions for the complete annihilation of the Soviet Union, calculations written in cold numbers that translated into tens, even hundreds of millions of lives. What most people know about the Cold War is the constant tension, the nuclear arms race, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, but buried in declassified files, hidden away for decades, lies something far darker: the fact that America had already mapped out World War III before the dust of World War II had even settled. With the Soviet Union rising as the next great rival, the strategists believed that the only way to secure victory was through preemptive, overwhelming destruction. One of these chilling scenarios was called Operation Dropshot in 1949. The plan called for over 300 nuclear bombs and 20,000 tons of conventional explosives to rain down on 200 Soviet cities within 30 days. Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, all were listed as targets. The estimated casualties: upwards of 100 million Soviet citizens in the opening strike alone. And that was just the beginning. Later revisions of nuclear war plans projected global death tolls of 300 to 500 million people, a scale of death that would dwarf even the horrors of World War II. Even more disturbing is how casually such destruction was discussed. Within Pentagon documents, the death of millions was reduced to acceptable losses, a phrase that turned human lives into statistics on a chart. These were not wild fantasies, but real, actionable plans, locked away in safes and reviewed at the highest levels of government. This is the story of those plans: the hidden strategies, the unthinkable numbers, and the terrifying reality that the world came closer than most people realize to total nuclear annihilation. The birth of a catastrophic idea. The seeds of America's nuclear annihilation plans were planted not long after the final bombs of World War II fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The mushroom clouds had barely dissipated when U.S. military planners realized something both intoxicating and terrifying for the first time in history. One nation held a weapon so powerful it could decide the fate of the world with a single strike. In 1945, the United States was not only victorious, but also unrivaled. Its economy was booming, its military unmatched, and it alone possessed nuclear weapons. Yet this sense of supremacy was laced with dread. The Soviet Union, though battered by the war, had emerged as a continental power with a massive army, occupying much of Eastern Europe. Washington saw the Kremlin not as an ally, but as a looming adversary. Within months of the war's end, American strategists began thinking not of peace, but of the next war, one they feared was inevitable. From Hiroshima to Moscow, the next targets. The U.S. military quickly moved to integrate nuclear weapons into its strategic doctrine. Declassified documents revealed chilling discussions as early as 1946, in which Pentagon officials debated the number of bombs necessary to cripple the Soviet Union in a surprise strike. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just tragedies, they were test cases, laboratories of destruction that allowed the U.S. to estimate how many bombs it would take to obliterate another superpower. The logic was brutal. If 2 bombs could destroy Japan's will to fight, perhaps a few hundred could erase the Soviet Union from the map. Analysts began producing target lists, identifying the major Soviet cities, transportation hubs, and industrial centers that would need to be vaporized in the event of war. Moscow and Leningrad were always at the top. Kiev, Kharkov, Baku, and Tbilisi were not far behind. Each city was marked not just as a military objective, but as a vital artery of Soviet life. Destroy them, and the whole body collapses. Operation Dropshot Apocalypse on paper. 1949. These theoretical discussions had crystallized into a formal plan known as Operation Dropshot, drafted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It outlined in stunning detail how the United States would wage World War III. The plan called for 300 nuclear bombs dropped on 200 Soviet cities in the first 30 days, 20,000 tons of conventional explosives to complement the nuclear strikes, target lists including every major Soviet urban center, from Moscow to Vladivostok. Estimated casualties 100 million Soviet deaths in the opening phase alone. Dropshot envisioned a war beginning in 1957 when the Soviets were expected to have only a limited nuclear capability. The United States believed that by striking first and with overwhelming force, it could cripple the USSR before it had a chance to retaliate. Perhaps most chilling is how the plan treated these numbers. The potential deaths of tens of millions were reduced to operational objectives. Charts and tables listed destruction percentages like corporate balance sheets. Moscow 85% destruction, Leningrad 70%, Kiev 60%. These were not just projections, they were goals. The cold logic of preemption. Why did American leaders think this way? The answer lies in the psychology of the early Cold War. After Hiroshima, U.S. strategists were gripped by the belief that nuclear monopoly was temporary. They knew the Soviets were racing to build their own bomb. And indeed, by 1949, the USSR detonated its first nuclear device. The monopoly was over, and panic spread in Washington. This urgency fueled preemptive thinking. If war was inevitable, many argued, why not strike first while the United States still had the advantage? This doctrine, known as the first strike, dominated U.S. nuclear planning for decades. The idea was simple but horrifying: better to kill millions of Soviets today than risk losing tens of millions of Americans tomorrow. The rationale was laid bare in a 1950 National Security Council report, which stated bluntly that the United States must be prepared to wage atomic and total war against the Soviet Union in order to preserve the American way of life. In other words, annihilation was not a last resort. It was an option actively on the table. Casualties on a scale. Never imagined to understand the sheer brutality of these plans? Consider the numbers. Dropshot estimated that in the opening nuclear blitz, around 100 million Soviet citizens would die. That's nearly half the population of the USSR at the time. Entire generations would vanish in a matter of weeks. But the destruction would not stop there. Fallout would spread across Eurasia, poisoning agriculture, water supplies, and air. Millions more would die slow deaths from radiation. The Soviet economy would collapse overnight, leaving survivors in a wasteland of rubble, starvation, and disease. Even planners acknowledged that their estimates were conservative. Some believed that the death toll could climb as high as 200 million. This was not war in any traditional sense. It was extermination, turning human lives into statistics. What makes these plans even more disturbing is the cold detachment with which they were discussed. Declassified meeting notes revealed generals and policymakers debating not whether to kill millions, but how efficiently to do it. Lives became numbers, and numbers became acceptable losses. In Pentagon jargon, civilian deaths were described as collateral damage. Even though civilians were the primary targets, the goal was not just to destroy Soviet military capability, but to break the will of the people by reducing their cities to ash. This mindset, reducing life to data points, allowed American officials to rationalize the unthinkable. If the destruction of 100 million Soviets guaranteed the survival of 150 million Americans, then the math made sense. That was the calculus of Cold War survival. The Soviet shadow. Of course, the United States was not alone in this apocalyptic thinking. As soon as the Soviets acquired nuclear weapons, they began crafting their own annihilation plans. The two superpowers mirrored each other in a deadly dance, each convinced the other was plotting first strike. But it was the United States, with its early nuclear monopoly and overwhelming industrial power, That first envisioned the destruction of the other on such a massive scale. In doing so, it set the tone for the entire Cold War, an era defined not by battles fought, but by wars, imagined wars, that, if ever unleashed, would have ended civilization itself. Escalation from drop shot to the PSYOP. If the late 1940s were the years when the United States imagined annihilation, the 1950s were when it became a permanent institution. The nuclear monopoly had ended by 1949, the Soviets had detonated their first atomic device, and only 4 years later, they shocked the world again with the successful test of a hydrogen bomb. The nuclear arms race was no longer theoretical. It was an accelerating spiral that threatened to spin out of control. In response, the U.S. dramatically expanded its nuclear arsenal. What had once been a handful of bombs became hundreds, then thousands. By the mid-1950s, America possessed enough warheads to destroy the Soviet Union many times over. But sheer numbers were not enough. Washington needed a coherent plan, a blueprint for how to actually use these weapons if the unthinkable day ever arrived. That blueprint was the PSYOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, introduced in 1960. If Operation Dropshot was a sketch of Armageddon, the PSYOP was its fully engineered design, the PSYOP apocalypse in a binder. The PSYOP was more than just a war plan, it was the war plan. It unified the nuclear strike options of the Air Force, Navy, and Army into a single coordinated strategy. It mapped out, in meticulous detail, exactly how the United States would destroy the Soviet Union, its Eastern European allies, and even China if conflict broke out. The scale was staggering. The original PSYOP 62 for fiscal year 1962 called for 3,200 nuclear weapons launched in the first strike, targets spread across the USSR, Eastern Europe, and China. An estimated 425 million deaths within the first weeks. Those numbers are not misprints. Nearly 500 million human beings were projected as casualties in a single U.S. strike. It was the industrialization of death on a level that even the Holocaust or World War II's firebombings could not compare with, and the planners knew it. A declassified summary of PSYOP 62 shows a grim note. High levels of civilian casualties are unavoidable. In reality, civilian populations were the targets. Overkill. The doctrine of excess. One of the most chilling aspects of the PSYOP was what critics later called overkill, because each branch of the military insisted on having its own strike options. Cities were often assigned multiple bombs far more than needed. For example, Moscow might be hit with a dozen or more hydrogen bombs, each capable of destroying the city many times over. Leningrad could receive 6 or 7. Smaller cities might be targeted by multiple warheads as well, simply because of inter-service competition. This redundancy meant that even if half of the weapons failed, the destruction would still be total. But it also meant that the human cost was grotesquely magnified. If one bomb could destroy a city, why drop 12? The answer was bureaucratic inertia and military pride. Each branch wanted its share of Armageddon, the rise of the hydrogen bomb. The other escalation was technological. The atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were devastating, but they were mere firecrackers compared to the hydrogen bomb. Hiroshima, 15 kilotons. First H-bomb Ivy Mike, 1952, 10 megatons, over 600 times more powerful. Soviet Tsar Bomba, 1961, 50 megatons, 3,000 times Hiroshima. The shift from kilotons to megatons turned nuclear war into a planetary event. These weapons didn't just destroy cities, they erased regions. A single megaton bomb could flatten everything within a 5-mile radius and ignite firestorms for miles beyond. The fallout could poison ecosystems hundreds of miles downwind. PSYOP 62 envisioned thousands of such weapons falling within hours. The Earth itself would shudder under the assault. Some scientists even speculated that a full exchange could ignite the atmosphere or trigger a nuclear winter, plunging the planet into decades of darkness and famine. Eisenhower's paradox, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a former general, understood the horror of these plans better than most. Yet he also believed nuclear weapons were essential to keeping the peace. His doctrine of massive retaliation declared that any Soviet aggression, even a conventional attack in Europe, would be met with overwhelming nuclear force. This paradox defined the era. The weapons were too terrible to use, but too essential to abandon. Eisenhower himself privately admitted that the PSYOP was crazy. His aides recalled him slamming his fist on the table after a briefing, shouting that the plan was just as bad as the enemy's. Yet, he approved it anyway. The logic of deterrence demanded it. Without a credible plan to destroy the Soviet Union, America's threats would ring hollow, and so the plan remained, lurking in Pentagon safes, ready to be executed at a moment's notice. Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The true test of these apocalyptic blueprints came in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When reconnaissance revealed Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, President John F. Kennedy faced the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. At the height of the crisis, the Joint Chiefs of Staff urged Kennedy to authorize airstrikes and an invasion. What they did not emphasize was that under the PSYOP, any U.S. strike on Soviet forces even in Cuba risked triggering the full nuclear plan. The military's default was escalation to total war. Kennedy resisted. He later confided that if he had followed his general's advice, 200 million people would have been killed in the first 24 hours. The world came within a breath of the annihilation envisioned in Dropshot and the PSYOP. Numbers beyond comprehension. By the mid-1960s, the U.S. nuclear arsenal had peaked at over 30,000 warheads. The Soviets were not far behind. Both sides had built the capacity not just to destroy each other, but to exterminate humanity. The numbers remain difficult to grasp. Imagine every major Soviet and Chinese city erased, hundreds of millions dead in days, radiation spreading to Europe, Asia, and eventually across the globe, civilization itself collapsing under the weight of famine, disease, and chaos. And yet these scenarios were not fringe. They were the official, meticulously prepared war plans of the U.S. government. The annihilation of entire peoples was typed up in neat binders, updated annually, and drilled into the command structure of the military. The logic of the abyss. The tragedy of these plans is that they were never designed to be executed. Their real purpose was deterrence to scare the Soviets into never launching their own attack. Yet, in building them, the U.S. walked right up to the edge of the abyss. Every year, military exercises rehearsed the end of the world. Every morning, crews sat on alert in underground silos and airborne command posts, ready to turn the key if the order came. The machinery of annihilation was kept polished, humming, always ready. And once such machinery exists, the risk of its use is never zero. Miscommunication, false alarms, rogue actors all could have triggered Armageddon. Several times during the Cold War, false radar readings or malfunctioning systems convinced U.S. or Soviet commanders that an attack was underway. Each time, restraint by individuals prevented catastrophe. But the PSYOP was there, waiting. If the wrong person ever believed the wrong signal, the age of mutually assured destruction. By the late 1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had reached nuclear parity. America no longer held a decisive advantage. It could destroy the Soviet Union. But the USSR could also wipe out America. This fragile equilibrium gave rise to the doctrine that defined the rest of the Cold War: mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea was simple yet terrifying. If both sides could guarantee the total annihilation of the other, then neither would dare strike first. Peace would be preserved not by trust or cooperation, but by the certainty of Armageddon. Yet MAD was not just a political slogan. It was a machine. constructed out of war plans, missile silos, and doomsday procedures. It institutionalized annihilation as the foundation of world order. The doomsday machine becomes real. In 1964, Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove satirized the nuclear standoff with its absurd doomsday machine that would automatically destroy the world if attacked. What audiences didn't know was that something disturbingly close already existed. By the 1970s, both Washington and Moscow had systems designed to guarantee retaliation, even if their leadership was wiped out in a first strike. The U.S. Looking Glass Command airborne command posts that circled the skies 24/7, capable of transmitting launch orders if ground-based command centers were destroyed. Soviet Dead Hand Perimeter System. An automatic retaliation system activated in the 1980s. If sensors detected nuclear detonations on Soviet soil and no communication from leadership, it could automatically launch a full nuclear response. These systems meant that nuclear war could, in theory, continue. Even if no one was alive to command it, humanity had built machines to ensure its own destruction, just to maintain the illusion of safety. False alarms and close calls. With thousands of warheads on hair trigger alert, the possibility of accidental apocalypse was not theoretical. It happened repeatedly. 1979. NORAD computer glitch. A training tape simulating a massive Soviet strike was mistakenly run on live systems, convincing U.S. command that hundreds of missiles were inbound. Crews prepared for retaliation before the error was caught. 1980s missile launch error. A faulty chip in a computer triggered warnings of a Soviet attack. Again, nuclear forces were scrambled before the mistake was discovered. 1983. Petrov incident. Soviet early warning systems reported 5 incoming U.S. missiles. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, on duty that night, refused to believe it was real. He judged correctly that it was a false alarm. His decision may have saved the world from automatic retaliation. Each incident shows how close the world came to executing the PSYOP and its Soviet counterpart, not because of deliberate decisions, but because of technical errors and human misinterpretations. The nuclear stockpile beyond imagination. By the mid-1970s, the nuclear arsenals had grown to grotesque proportions. United States $31,000 nuclear warheads. Soviet Union 40,000 nuclear warheads, the largest arsenal ever assembled. These were not just stored away, they were actively deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs buried in silos across the U.S., Midwest, and Siberia. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs prowling the oceans, ready to fire from hidden positions. Strategic bombers on constant alert. Nuclear weapons loaded. Pilots sleeping beside their planes. Each missile carried multiple warheads, many equipped with MIRVs, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. A single missile could rain down 10 warheads on 10 separate cities. The numbers stretched beyond human comprehension. In theory, just a fraction of these weapons could wipe out every major city on Earth. The rest would be overkill, ensuring the planet's destruction many times over. Limited nuclear war. An illusion faced with the absurdity of total annihilation. U.S. planners in the 1970s and 1980s began exploring the idea of a limited nuclear war. Could nuclear weapons be used in small, controlled doses, say, against military bases or isolated regions, without triggering full retaliation? The answer, almost everyone admitted privately, was no. The logic of escalation made it impossible. Once the first mushroom cloud appeared, who could guarantee it would stop at one? Yet plans for limited strikes were drafted anyway. The Reagan administration even discussed decapitating strikes aimed at Soviet leadership bunkers, hoping to blind Moscow before it could respond. The Soviets, in turn, feared such scenarios deeply and built massive underground complexes and redundant command systems to survive them. But the reality was that no war plan could be controlled. Once nuclear weapons were used, the machine of MAD would almost certainly take over, grinding forward toward global annihilation. Reagan and the Evil Empire. In the early 1980s, nuclear fears reached a fever pitch. U.S. President Ronald Reagan denounced the Soviet Union as an evil empire and launched a massive military buildup. New missiles were deployed in Europe, the Pershing II and cruise missiles, capable of reaching Moscow within minutes. The Soviets responded by placing their own forces on higher alert, fearing a surprise decapitation strike. Nuclear war exercises like NATO's Able Archer 83 were interpreted by Moscow as possible preparations for a real first strike. Historians now believe that in 1983, during Able Archer, the Soviet leadership was so alarmed that it placed nuclear forces on standby, convinced the West might actually attack. The world came as close as it had during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but most of the public never knew. Star Wars. The illusion of escape. Reagan also unveiled his Strategic Defense Initiative SDI, nicknamed Star Wars. The plan envisioned space-based lasers and missile interceptors that could shoot down Soviet ICBMs, creating a protective shield over the United States. Critics called it a fantasy. The technology was decades away from feasibility, and even if partially effective, it could never stop a full-scale Soviet strike of thousands of warheads. But to the Soviets, SDI was terrifying. If the U.S. developed even a partially successful shield, it could undermine deterrence, making a first strike seem winnable. This fear drove Moscow into even more frantic weapons development, straining its already weakening economy. Ironically, SDI may have contributed to the Soviet Union's eventual collapse, not because of its military effectiveness, but because of the psychological and financial pressure it imposed, the human cost forgotten. Throughout this era, the plans remained brutally indifferent to human life. Pentagon war games treated millions of deaths as statistics on a chart. Civil defense manuals offered laughable advice, like duck and cover or hiding in basements, as if survival were possible under global thermonuclear war. The truth was different. Studies like the famous 1983 Nuclear Winter Report showed that even a limited exchange of a few hundred warheads could loft enough soot into the atmosphere to block sunlight, collapse agriculture, and starve billions. The U. War plans, with thousands of warheads launched, would have destroyed not just the Soviet Union, but human civilization itself. The annihilation of the USSR was always, in reality, the annihilation of the world, a strange resolution. By the late 1980s, something changed. The Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev sought arms control and de-escalation. Reagan, despite his fiery rhetoric, found common ground in his later years. Treaties like the INF Treaty 1987 began dismantling entire classes of nuclear weapons. For the first time in decades, the nuclear stockpiles began to shrink. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with negotiations and collapse. Yet the plans remained. Even today, the U.S. retains nuclear war plans, modern descendants of the PSYOP, now called OPLANs. Thousands of warheads still exist, waiting in silos, submarines, and air bases. The machinery of annihilation has not been dismantled, only mothballed.